What up, y'all? Today we're going to be talking about a macroeconomic trend that just got a few hits on our Korea and which ties directly into some text from Howard Marks's book Mastering the Market Cycle. Given that we just did another video on Howard Marks's book The Most Important Thing, I thought it would be fitting to talk about what's being talked about. You're watching Sekidul, and today we're talking about population growth and decline, and more importantly, what it means for Korea's economic future. Now, before we continue, we'd just like to remind you that this channel is meant for general education purposes only and isn't meant to replace the legal or financial advice from a paid professional. When it comes to investments, it's always healthy to take everything with a fair bit of skepticism regardless of the source, and that includes us. For that reason, nothing we say here should be taken as a basis for investment, and you'll have to do your own work and thinking before deciding whether taking up a position on any stock mentioned here is in your best interest. Want to know how? Well, if you scroll down a little bit, hit the like and subscribe buttons. We'll do our best to help you figure out how to figure out this game for yourself. But with that being said, let's get to it. Alright, so the book I'm drawing from is different from the last video on market cycles that we were looking at, where we looked into the most important thing. Today we're looking into Mastering the Market Cycle, which is by the same author, Howard Marks, but rather than trying to identify where we are in a particular cycle, I want to refer to this specific graphic by Reddit user Experimental Failures using data from Statistics Korea, which hit the top of our Korea over the weekend. Now, this graphic shows last year's population distribution by age, ranging from 1-year-olds to 100 and over. Without too much analysis, we can see, as would be expected, that a bulk of Koreans born prior to the 50s have died or emigrated or transcended space-time, and as such, their representation in the overall population is small and shrinking. This happens as we age. People don't really live up to 100 usually or past it. Next, we have boomers and Gen X, who make up the largest bulk of the population. This is followed by a small trough of millennials, early millennials, prior to a bump in population for the MZ Sedae or the Z Sedae. I don't like the term MZ Sedae because it literally puts together, a whole two completely different generations. Anyway, it's met by a very sharp drop off of whatever we're calling kids under 20 these days. Now, I think it's pretty clear that I couldn't really find the perfect shapes to match the generational movements, but hopefully this helps illustrate how population trends can change significantly over time. Also, it's not hard to see cycles when extrapolated over 50-year periods, but what's more important than identifying the more specific aspects of these smaller cycles is watching the overall downward trend. Now let's pull from the book to identify exactly why this population crisis is actually a crisis, like why it actually affects our economic future and what is being done to stem the tide. Now, taken directly from the book, Marx writes, "One of the main determinants of each year's economic output is the number of hours worked. In turn, the most fundamental factor underlying increases in hours worked is population growth. Growth in the population means that there are more people working each year to make and sell products, and also more people to buy and consume them, encouraging production. More production equals more GDP. If the population is growing, hours worked tend to grow, and so does GDP. Thus, births are one of the main reasons for the usual presumption that economic growth will be positive. On the other hand, if the population is shrinking, positive GDP growth faces a significant headwind. So basically, if we track the improvement of a country's economy by their GDP and we break down GDP into its simplest parts, we can best understand the importance of population growth as this. More babies means more people. More people means more workers. More workers means both more production through an increase of hours worked and more consumption, as more workers require more production to meet their needs. This is how to best understand the correlation between population trends and economic growth or shrinkage. Now, if we're to assume that economic growth will continue in this way through the process of citizens getting busy and pushing out babies, we would expect population growth to resemble a pyramid, and that's exactly what we see in certain aspects of the chart from the top to the bottom of the baby boom generation. It's no coincidence then that the maturation of this generation coincided with the nation's rapid industrialization in the back half of the last century. From that point on, however, we see a rapid population decline, with over 3 times the number of 50-year-old citizens when compared to the number of 1-year-olds. Now, there are a large number of reasons why birth rates and population rates change so drastically over time. I'm sure that you can think of many. Some of the things that Marx identifies as being factors that can alter a nation's birth rate do apply to us, such as the economic conditions and changing social mores, which have led to what has been termed the Sampo generation, also known as the generation in which sacrificing marriage, children, and courtship is a popular lifestyle choice. This obviously isn't specific to Korea either, as there is a correlation between national economic development and declining birth rates in countries around the globe, as evidenced by this visual provided by the World Economic Forum. Obviously, if you compare us to the other OECD nations, we're not doing very well comparatively. Now naturally, this is an issue that we've known about for a very long time, as you can tell. So, why has it always felt like something that will hurt us in the future and not right now? Well, Marx makes the point that birth rates affect productivity in the long run, since newborns, toddlers, children, and teenagers aren't ready resources of labor and could take about 2 decades to make an impact on the country's economic output. Now, if we jump ahead 50 years and we assume that our current 1-year-olds have hit the age of our current largest cohort, we can see how much smaller the workforce will be when compared to now. Fewer people generally means lower output, because also fewer people means less demand and therefore less need for more production. But this is where we get to the second aspect of growth: production. Because changes in productivity can potentially make up for changes in birth rate trends. Specifically, Marx states that whatever the rate of population growth may be, GDP will grow faster if productivity is rising or slower if it's falling. This suggests that there are many ways to supplement population, which is what he gets into next, using historical examples like the Industrial Revolution, the improvement of access to automobiles and electricity, the advent of computers, and now the changes we're seeing in the information age. I would have included the invention of steel, but I didn't write this book. Anyways, let's talk about the context of the Republic of Korea. Now, the first factor that he identifies as being important to economic national output based on hours worked and output per hour is demographic movements. Here he refers to Chinese workers moving from farm to city and enabling the country to become the manufacturing powerhouse of the world through this way. Farmers moving to cities with factories means that they can stock the factories with more labor, which means they can provide more output. Another example that he uses is immigration from Latin America to the US, which he identifies as being an important source of workforce supplementation in light of the US's declining birth rate. Next, we have education. Marx argues that the deterioration of the public system in the US is likely to have a negative effect on workers' ability to contribute to the economy in the future, as well as their ability to generate substantial incomes with which to consume. These negative trends are likely to work counter to the positive effects from the influx of immigrants in the US. Now, in Korea's situation, where he doesn't talk about it, this is just my personal reading, education has been determined as a fundamental aspect of the nation's global competitiveness by the major governmental parties for the past half-century. Unlike the US, the main issues aren't really about funding for schools or ensuring that everybody has access to high-quality education, but rather equipping students with more skills that are relevant and applicable to life in the 21st century. This is moving away from the traditional, Suneung test-based education style. And this leads us to technological innovation and automation. Innovation allows for new businesses and technologies to spring up, replacing less efficient, older, or redundant businesses or tech. Specifically, he states that new technologies overtake human effort as well as old technologies. New tech can make production more efficient and convenient while creating new jobs to support the new technology. New tech based around automation has the ability to replace human labor and improve efficiency and therefore improve productivity. One issue with technological innovation and automation, though, is that it can turn workers redundant and lead to unemployment. This can create a negative net effect if workers are unable to adjust, re-educate, and re-enter the workforce in another, let's say, realm or area of expertise. If this is the case, then they need to find another way to supplement their incomes and continue the same level of consumption. Otherwise, there will be an overall negative net effect by technological innovation and automation generally. Finally, we have globalization. Globalization, or the intertwining of nations, cultures, and economies internationally and over time, can significantly improve global output as countries with surplus workers can help supplement production for countries with surplus demand. Naturally, this means that globalization will affect different countries differently, and we see that every single day. We see it in the global south versus the global north. Now, these factors, while distinct from one another, directly affect each other. For example, demographic movements in a globalized framework mean that workers can move from country to country in search of more gainful employment. This can lead to increased production capacity much faster and much cheaper than increasing the birth rate, because the human capital that the country receives, does not come at the taxpayer's expense. In other words, the cost of maintaining the infrastructure necessary to educate, raise, and socialize the worker was borne by another country. Now, the country which bore that cost will also increase in consumption if the foreign worker sends money back to their home country, which is the case for many overseas foreign workers. Now, on the opposite side of things, it can also work negatively, as it can also lead to brain drain in which the best educated of our country choose to join a different labor market. One clear example of this was during last year's collective bargaining agreement with HMM. Their seafarers union saw a large number of employees leave for larger international companies where they would be doing the same job for double or triple the salary. Now, the same can be said in industries like tech and manufacturing, which can draw high achievers out of the country, and if that's the case, it would provide an overall net negative outcome. Finally, the ability to procure cheaper labor from abroad comes with an inherent possibility that new labor will force out existing labor, especially if it's cheaper. This can lead to social unrest, xenophobia, culture clashes, ghettoization, and any number of negative outcomes as populations are forced to coexist with one another. Another reflexive force is new tech and education, as new tech can improve education through democratization and access to information. But it can also lead to negative externalities based on cognitive development, like screen addiction and negative self-perceptions due to social media and that type of stuff. You know, the stuff that we always read about in the news. So anyways, all four of these factors are very effective at supplementing population decline. However, in all of their cases, we have to take the good with the bad, and we need to prepare to do so. And with all that, that was a lot. I actually was planning to talk about what we can do to address the falling birth rate and to address the population decline, but we're already at 12 minutes. I didn't expect it to go this long, so I'm making an executive decision. We're going to do a part 2 later, maybe next week. Now, let me just quickly do a quick summary of what we talked about, because I know it was a lot. Fundamentally, a nation's economic growth and GDP growth are strongly correlated with birth rate and its effects on population. An increasing birth rate means more people means more workers means more production and consumption. This in turn means more growth. A declining birth rate, or the inverse pyramid shape that we see in Korea's age distribution chart, means that there will be fewer workers to replace the production and consumption of past generations. Lower production can mean unemployment or lower consumption, which can mean lower demand, which means lower production, which can lead to an economic death spiral where low demand leads to lower production, which leads to fewer jobs, which leads to lower demand, and so on and so forth until either people leave, society collapses, or some other fun outcome happens. Luckily, there are a number of factors that we can employ to stave off such crises, such as demographic movements, education, tech and automation, and globalization. And this leads to the big question: what could we be doing to slow down the population crisis in the near future? All this and more on the next episode of Dragon Ball Z. Peace.